UFC 291, Poirier versus Gaethje 2 takes place this weekend, and I'm going to go through the entire card, starting with the early prelims, ending with the main events, giving my prediction and breakdown for every single fight on the card, starting with the early prelim opener of Matthew Semelsberger versus Uros Medic. Doesn't make any sense as a matchup whatsoever. I don't know why Uros Medic is moving up to 170 pounds. He is a 155er. I guess he doesn't like the weight cut, but I don't think that's any excuse. I feel like Matthew Semelsberger is the type of fighter where if you allow him to have a physically imposing presence over you in the octagon, he's going to find that KO shot. And we've seen that in a lot of his fights. We saw that against Jake Matthews. I thought he even beat Jeremiah Wells. And Jeremiah Wells is a very good prospect in his own right in the welterweight division, despite being quite old. Matthew Semelsberger has a knack to catch you and drop you. And I think if he does that to a smaller Uros Medic, although might be a bit more technically sound than some of the other welterweights that he's fought on the feet, I think that Matthew Semelsberger is going to be able to find that shot. Really do. I think he's going to be a little bit too imposing, and I reckon he'll find it. I don't understand some of these matchups the UFC's been making recently. I feel like Matthew Semelsberger deserves a bit more of a test, like he arguably did beat Wells. He's not a bottom feeder level welterweight on the roster, so I'm inclined to pick him here. I think he's got a massive power advantage. I don't see how Uros Medic, although he does have some power in his own right, I don't see how he's going to be able to get respect from Matthew Semelsberger, who's fought as high up as light heavyweight in his career. And he's just pretty good. You know what I mean? He's hard to hold down. It's going to be a stand-up match. And I'm not convinced that a win over Omar Morales at this point, who I think is 37, is enough for me to believe that you beat Matthew Semelsberger at 170. I'm sorry. We move on. Up the card to another fight, which is Miranda Maverick versus Priscila Cachoeira. This is an interesting matchup again. I'm going to go with Priscila Cachoeira because I'm kind of done trying to reason with women's MMA. In all honesty, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. Miranda Maverick, in my opinion, is more talented than Priscila Cachoeira. But at the end of the day, Priscila Cachoeira is, you know, I'm not going to even put out the key words there for YouTube to maybe demonetize this. But let's just say she's more likely to settle down in a relationship with a Miranda Maverick than Miranda Maverick is. Let's just say that. And she's way more masculine. And that's saying something because it's Miranda Maverick. And that's saying something. Priscila Cachoeira is more masculine. And I can't help but notice that like 80% of the time, that seems to be what it comes down to. We just saw Denise Gomez versus Yasmin Yaregui, who was supposed to be one of the best prospects in women's MMA. And then just Denise Gomez is butcher than her, so she wins. I'm going to go Priscila Cachoeira. She's a big underdog, and that's entirely what I'm basing this off of. There's no rhyme or reason to predicting women's MMA. I've just given up, so I'm going to go with what I actually think is a true dictator of who's going to win a matchup between these two fighters in women's MMA, and that's Priscila Cachoeira based on more Nunes-ish, pretty much. We move on. Up the card, Jake Matthews versus Darrius Flowers. This is interesting to me. Darrius Flowers versus Jake Matthews. Again, I don't understand this matchup being made. He won on the Contender Series based on his opponent's injury, and now he's been given a shot in the UFC. He was supposed to be fighting Eric Gonzalez in the UFC in February, but oh well. He's a finisher. Jake Matthews is difficult to finish. We saw even against Semelsberger when he was getting rocked and dropped every round, he was still very, very difficult to finish, and he stayed in there and came back to have a pretty decent third round as well. He's a hard-to-finish opponent. Simple as that. And I think on short notice, I'm going to trust him to win a little bit more than Darrius Flowers because he's had a full training camp for this fight. He was supposed to be fighting Gabe Green in May. That got delayed. Then he was supposed to be fighting Miguel Beza on this very card. And Darrius Flowers has basically got the call up to take this fight on short notice. Salt Lake City, short notice. Matthews has had a long time to prepare. I've got to side with a guy who's had a training camp when this fight is going to be at altitude, especially when it's not like Matthews has a history of being finished by strikes. Darrius Flowers is a very powerful man, but I think if that doesn't go his way, which likely it won't in the first round, that's a lot more asking of Darrius Flowers than it is to just ask him to win. I think his only chance to win is by first round KO, and that's not enough for me to pick him over Jake Matthews. So I'm going Jake Matthews winning this fight either by late rounds TKO or late rounds finish, or maybe winning based on the later decision rounds. We move on. Up the card, CJ Vergara versus Vinicius Salvador. I'm going to be going with CJ Vergara here. The toughness on display in his last fight can't be ignored. He's very, very tough. I hate to base it off of that. I'm not basing it off of that. I do think he's somewhat technical in general. He lost to Tatsuro Taira, had a very close decision with Ode Osborne. It is what it is. He beat Clayton Rodriguez by split decision. Very, very close fight again. But Vinicius Salvador in his last fight that he had against Victor Altamirano, those are two of the least technical flyweights I've seen in recent history. And I just don't see him getting off the wheel kicks that CJ Vergara was getting hit with by Daniel Lacerda, to which he still came back to win. So I think that toughness is going to it's going to play a factor here. And I think as the fight goes on, we're going to see Vinicius Salvador to start to slow down a little bit too much. The decision-making on display in this fight with Victor Altamirano is just something that I can't trust with reputation for picking him. Like, that's just how it is. He was doing some really silly stuff. He had, like, opportunity to try and do something and maybe opportunity to try and turn things around, but he just let the fight get away from him and decided to be a bit more playing around, mocking, doing a bunch of, like, emotes and stuff like that, and just a bunch of silly decision-making. I don't like that against CJ Vergara. I think he's got a higher likelihood of making this a lot more technical, and I think I'm going to go with him because of that reason. We move on. Up the card, Roman Kopylov versus Claudio Ribeiro. Claudio Ribeiro is a dangerous man. He's a very dangerous man. But Roman Kopylov has that Russian boxing striking defense. And that's something that's going to come in very, very handy here. Because Claudio Ribeiro, what's he known for? Swinging massive overhands and having a bit of a ground game as well. First of all, I don't see him getting down Roman Kopylov. Roman Kopylov has shown great takedown defense in his career. He even showed good takedown defense. Had Darrius in real trouble in the third round, but that was when he was a little bit younger. I think Roman Kopylov, we're watching him come into his prime. You know what I mean? He's 32 years of age. He didn't have much experience when he first got to the UFC, when he was 7-0. Hadn't really fought anyone too amazing on the regional scene either. And he just sort of like rushed his way to the UFC without having the experience. His last two fights against Alessio Di Chirico and Pinelli Soriano, I think Soriano and Ribeiro are pretty similar in style. You know what I mean? Very similar, except I think Pinelli Soriano is a little bit more intimidating of a threat on the feet. So I'm going to go with Roman Kopylov. I love his boxing defense. I think he'll be able to defend himself against the big power shots of Claudio Ribeiro. And I think he'll also give Claudio Ribeiro something to worry about as the rounds go on. So I'm going to go Roman Kopylov, third round TKO. As soon as I saw this matchup made of Kopylov and Ribeiro, I thought third round TKO to Kopylov. That's what I'm going to go with here. As the fight goes on, Ribeiro will get slower and slower, and Kopylov will start putting together those combos that he started working on recently. We move on. Up the card, Trevin Giles versus Gabriel Bonfim. I'm going to go with Gabriel Bonfim over Trevin Giles. This is a worrying one because we did just see Ismael Bonfim get a little bit embarrassed as well by Benoit Saint-Denis, and that was a little bit of a hype derailment for him. But welterweight is a much easier division to succeed in. And Trevin Giles, although I do think he's got some talent, like I think some fighters just have a knack for something. You know what I mean? They're just naturally okay at something. And I think Trevin Giles has like a natural talent for boxing. Like the way he throws his hands, how calm he is, I think is very impressive. But Preston Parsons had a fight with him where I think Trevin Giles was making some really stupid mistakes. And I actually raged in the middle of that fight because I picked Trevin Giles, which he won. He won the fight. It was very close, but he won the fight. But he was making some very silly mistakes in the grappling as the fight went on. And if this isn't an early finish, which I believe can only come by way of Gabriel Bonfim getting it, then I think eventually there are going to be some tired grappling exchanges between the two of them. And in that case, I definitely trust Gabriel Bonfim a lot more than I do Trevin Giles. So I think that Gabriel Bonfim is going to show up big time here, continue his undefeated record. Remember, he is 14-0. That's not just an undefeated record. That's a lot of experience that comes with it. Even if it was against some cans early on, he did eventually step up and start beating some pretty good opponents at LFA. And then on the Contender Series as well, where he beat Trey Waters, which is actually a pretty good win in hindsight, because Trey Waters, since that fight, has now gone on to win 2 in a row against a 7-2 opponent at LFA, and then beat Josh Quinlan, undefeated UFC welterweight in his debut. So I'm definitely going to be going with Gabriel Bonfim here over Trevin Giles. I just think Giles makes too many mistakes on the ground, and if they start getting tired into the later rounds, I think is going to be a massive favor for Gabriel Bonfim. And if there is a finish early on, I don't see Giles being the one to get it. So all of it is in favor of Bonfim, in my opinion. I'm going to have to pick him. We move on. Up the card, Derrick Lewis versus Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I'm going to go with Marcos Rogerio de Lima. And I'm just going to say this in the nicest way I possibly can. That dog is gone from Derrick Lewis, it seems. The dog that he once had against Volkov and against other fighters that he was really hurt against and then came back to do good. In his last 3 fights, it's been gone. He gave a bit of a fight against Taito Ivasa. You know what I mean? He gave a bit of a fight against Taito Ivasa, and then Taito Ivasa came back and he crumbled to an elbow. Got KO'd, by the way. And by the way, this is a lot of TKOs to have at heavyweight back-to-back. Pavlovich to Ivasa. In between the Dorcas fights, Cyril Gahn finished him by strikes as well. And he's already been finished a few times. You know, Mark Hunt finished him by TKO. JDS finished him by TKO. This has happened. Sean Jordan finished him by TKO. Matt Mitrione finished him by TKO in a weird circumstance where he kind of like rammed his hip into him or something as Lewis was ducking down for a takedown. Either way, it's a lot of damage for a heavyweight to take for me to still be trusting him. Now, I know Marcos Rogerio de Lima has also taken some damage and he's been around. But when it comes to who's going to be winning the first minute of this fight, Marcos Rogerio de Lima, if I had to describe him, he's got great grappling, great jiu-jitsu skills, but he's also got really nasty counter hooks in the pocket, really nasty hands in the pocket that are wicked quick for a heavyweight as well. And he's got really nasty leg kicks. And Derrick Lewis stands so heavy over that lead leg. I think that if Marcos starts chopping up that leg, we could see a situation here early on, and this is going to be my prediction. Derrick Lewis could win. He's probably a good underdog here. He did beat Curtis Blades, which is just crazy to say because the career of Derrick Lewis makes absolutely no sense. But Marcos Rogerio de Lima, I think he's going to leg kick Derrick Lewis, and we're going to see Lewis lose footing from the leg kick. He's got such nasty chopping leg kicks. I think Derrick Lewis is going to fall down from a leg kick of Marcos Rogerio de Lima, trying to be a bit patient early on. If Marcos opens up with that chop to the leg, Lewis has got really skinny legs for a man his size. He's very top heavy. I can very clearly see Marcos doing a few feints, boom, big leg kick. Lewis's leg goes out from under him. He falls down, and Marcos is like immediately inside control to start the fight. And Derrick Lewis is a fighter when it comes to fighting shorter grapplers like Ilir Latifi and Blagoy Ivanov that can grapple at least. They're not really even grapplers, but they showed they can do it. Ilir Latifi is, but Blagoy can stand and will stand up in fights, but Derrick Lewis kind of had him shooting takedowns on him. So when he fights shorter guys that want to grapple against him, he relies on like momentum swings. And this is something that I'm going to take into consideration in the main event. Momentum swings are very hard to do at altitude. It's very hard because your cardio is way worse, and normally the guy who's losing is going to be losing way more if it's at altitude. You know what I mean? Like if someone starts getting momentum and starts winning and starts getting on top of you and getting takedowns, I don't trust you to just get yourself back up and start swinging KO blows all of a sudden. Much harder to do that at altitude. And I think against that style of opponent, Lewis needs momentum shifts. I don't think there's going to be as many of them at altitude. So I'm going with Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I think his leg kicks are going to be a bit too much for Derrick Lewis. We move on. And his ground game as well. And Derrick Lewis, last few fights, just gave it in. I know these guys hit hard. I completely understand that. But when Derrick Lewis gets hit, he just shells up in a ball. And you know what I mean? And when he gets taken down a few times, he just starts shelling up on the ground a little bit. I just don't see the same guy that was just standing back up against some of the other amazing heavyweights on the roster that he's beaten. So I'm going to have to go with Marcos Rogerio de Lima here by finish. We move on. Up the card, Stephen Thompson versus Michel Pereira. I'm going to go with Stephen Thompson. I was worried about Stephen Thompson here because I was thinking, you know what, Michel Pereira, I've seen him switch it up and dunk Zelim Imadaev and then go for a rear naked choke and nearly get it. So he does have a really impressive ability of doing that. And he did the same thing to Chaos Williams. But those guys aren't nearly as good on the feet as Stephen Thompson is. And I want to say this as well. Santiago Ponzinibbio ain't really that guy anymore. And he took Ponzinibbio to a very, very, very close decision. Pulled out of 2 fights in the meantime. Sean Brady and a fight with Stephen Thompson that got moved actually to this later date. Either way, he's been out for a long time. I like Michel Pereira, but his weight cut's never been good for him. His reach isn't the best for his size. I think he's going to have trouble on the feet here against Wonderboy. And I think his striking mainly worked against people that are flat-footed. You know what I mean? People that are flat-footed, standing in front of him. That's where Michel Pereira is going to be able to get off his flying knees. That's where he's going to get off his Superman punches. I think against an elusive Wonderboy, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find those shots. And I was watching back some Stephen Wonderboy fights. He's not lost on the ground. Like, Gilbert Burns takes down Neil Magny, immediately submits him. Gilbert Burns gets down Wonderboy, can't really do anything to him. You know what I mean? Wonderboy is adept enough to not get destroyed on the ground by his opponent. I know Belal Muhammad did dominate him, but he's not getting finished in those moments. Do I trust Michel Pereira to be able to hold down Wonderboy over 3 straight rounds where, you know, I don't think he's going to get a finish on Wonderboy if he takes it to the ground. Belal Muhammad couldn't, who I think is a better grappler than Michel Pereira, and Gilbert Burns couldn't, who I think is a way better grappler than Michel Pereira. So this is going to be a stand-up fight. If Michel Pereira wants to take it to the ground, he better be willing to do that for the distance of the fight. And at Salt Lake City, for Michel Pereira, a guy who was gassing out against Nico Price, couldn't finish him early on. We just saw Lawler dust him up, put him away in about 30 seconds. So I'm going to have to go with Wonderboy here. A guy in Michel Pereira who's known for gassing out is now going to be at Salt Lake City. The most annoying thing I've heard on the Embedded episode so far is we got here 2 weeks ago to get adjusted to the altitude. That's not adjusting to the altitude. We got here 2 weeks ago, so we're nice and adjusted. I don't like that. I heard Jan Blachowicz say it as well. Michel Pereira say it as well. I don't like that at all. I think that's not enough time. I think Wonderboy is going to be a lot more comfortable going the distance in this fight with his cardio as opposed to Michel Pereira. I'm going with Stephen Thompson. We move on. Up the card, Michael Chiesa versus Kevin Holland. Now, this is a worrying one. I'm going to go with Kevin Holland to win this fight. But I am worried about Kevin Holland winning this fight. Michael Chiesa could just half guard camp on top of Kevin Holland. That is very, very possible. Very possible. And that's the worry here that I have. If he does get down Holland, he might just lay in half guard on top and win based on that each and every round. I think there is too much time in this fight on the feet for Kevin Holland not to catch Michael Chiesa, who, as I said earlier with Trevin Giles being naturally talented at boxing, Michael Chiesa is not built for war. I know that sounds weird. It absolutely does. He's yoked, he's an athlete, he's in good shape. He will never understand striking. There's certain fighters like that. He will never understand striking. And with Kevin Holland, who's dangerous from all areas, I think he's going to be able to catch him on the feet. You know what I mean? Taking Neil Magny to a competitive decision. RDA win is really good, but what version of Chiesa are we getting here, man? What version of Chiesa are we getting? And it's nearly been 2 years since his fight with Sean Brady. He's on the ESPN desk. He's got his little roundup show with Paul Felder. He's 35 years of age. Kevin Holland's got momentum. He's coming off a big win against Santiago Ponzinibbio. Michael Chiesa just pulled out of a fight, or had a fight cancelled recently, so he's had to do a whole other training camp for this one without a payoff for him. I think that's a very strenuous task to get through. I feel like Kevin Holland's going to have too many opportunities here against Michael Chiesa, who's a little bit too obvious when he's trying to take down opponents. Although I am worried about Kevin Holland because of his grappling, it is something that he has been working on for a long time, and the only real time outside of facing off against Khamzat Chimaev that we've seen him really easily out-grappled is at middleweight. So I'm going to have to go with Kevin Holland here. I think he's going to be a bit too rangy for Chiesa, and Chiesa just throws punches. He's never going to be good at striking. There's certain people that just, you can teach them all you want. They can go to Tiger Muay Thai for 5 years. They won't look good throwing punches. And Chiesa just seems a little bit too hesitant with the stuff he's throwing. I can see him throwing in with his eyes closed at some moment as the fight goes on and they're both a bit tired, and Kevin Holland catches him with like a check hook, puts him down, and finishes him afterwards. I'm going with Kevin Holland. I think his dedication and commitment to the game at the moment is a lot more than that of Michael Chiesa. Even though Chiesa does have a solid chance here. We move on. Up the card, Tony Ferguson versus Bobby Green. Stylistic nightmare for Tony Ferguson. He is good, and Bobby Green, let's be real, has had some lackluster performances recently against Jared Gordon. He had a pretty lackluster performance as well against Drew Dober, where he ended up losing, but he looked great early on, and this is the point that I want to make. The reason why he didn't look that good against Jared Gordon, not aside from the headbutt, before that, in the fight, he wasn't looking good, is because Jared Gordon was making him go first. You know what I mean? We see that with Islam Makhachev made Bobby Green go first. Obviously, the grappling is there as well. But you look throughout his career, he doesn't do good against guys that make him go first. Moises, even though I thought Bobby Green won that fight, was backing up, making him go first, trying to catch him with counter shots. Bobby Green doesn't like leading the dance. His hands-down style is not built for leading the dance. His hands-down Philly shell style is built for defensiveness. You know what I mean? It's built for counterattacks. So he likes fighters coming straight towards him. And you saw against Jared Gordon, Gordon was backing up and just throwing these nice hooks on the counterattack of Bobby Green and catching him with his hands down coming in. Tony Ferguson's going to put the pressure on Bobby Green. And that's what Nasrat Haqparast tried to do. That's what Dober was trying to do early on, and he was getting tuned up by Bobby Green. That's what Alia Quinta tried to do. That's what Fiziev tried to do. You know what I mean? That's what Lando Venata tried to do to an extent, and then eventually started getting on his bike. But these fighters that get aggressive on Bobby Green and start going for him, it plays into his game, and Tony Ferguson doesn't know another way of fighting than to get aggressive and get in someone's face. I think neither of them are going to have a problem with the cardio in a 3-rounder here. I want Tony Ferguson to win. It'd be so sad to see him lose again. But at the end of the day, I think this is a tailor-made matchup for Bobby Green. I can see Ferguson getting clipped and put away on the back foot by Bobby. Bobby's going to be backing up, talking to him, putting his hands down. Ferguson's going to be throwing his shots with his chin wide up in the air as he does. And I can see Bobby Green pull right hand over the top of Ferguson's jab. You know what I mean? Jab him with Ferguson, pull out the way, body shot, headshot. I just think it's too bad for Tony Ferguson here. His style of striking plays right into the game of Bobby Green, and he never shoots a takedown, Tony Ferguson, or rarely shoots a takedown. Bobby Green's got this one in the bag. I think Tony Ferguson, man, like, and there's another part that I'm not even mentioning because I don't want to trash him too much. I like Tony Ferguson, but watching him versus Nate Diaz, I wish that fight never happened. It was great. Nate Diaz got his last fight in the UFC. Great walkout. They looked like two geriatric old men who had no idea what they were doing in the cage. Simple as that, really. That was a really embarrassing night for the UFC, in my opinion, to have those two as the main event. I know Diaz and Ferguson fans are going to be angry about me saying that, but I was embarrassed watching that fight as a fan. Like, oh my God. They are looking like old men, and Ferguson looks absolutely terrible. Maybe that Chandler KO was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm going to have to go with Bobby Green, tuning him up, and maybe getting a TKO. We move on. Up the card, Jan Blachowicz versus Alex Pereira. This is a low fight amount card right here. I thought I was going to be doing another 40 minutes. Either way, Jan Blachowicz versus Alex Pereira. I'm going to go with Alex Pereira here over Jan Blachowicz. Jan Blachowicz has the ability to take down Alex Pereira, but does he? You know what I mean? Because it took until the later rounds against Israel Adesanya for Blachowicz to be able to get a takedown on him. And maybe that was by design. Maybe that's what they were game planning for. But he did try a few times in those early rounds and had his takedowns shut down by a much weaker and smaller Israel Adesanya. Although he wasn't as weak and as small as people were suggesting he was in that matchup with Blachowicz, he's not Pereira against Blachowicz, who's way stronger with the underhooks, way stronger in the clinch. And we saw that in the Israel Adesanya fight, outside of in round 3, where they ended up in a bit of a spin, and Adesanya reversed a trip attempt from Pereira and ended up on top, and it seemed really bad for Pereira. Early in that fight, he was way stronger than Adesanya in the clinch, and I don't see Blachowicz having a massive, explosive takedown that's going to be so fast that Pereira doesn't see it coming. Blachowicz had Magomed Ankalaev with no legs under him, and never shot a takedown. Never shot one on him. Why? You've got a guy with no legs under him right now. Get a single leg. He cannot balance on one leg. I was so confused by the fight IQ of Jan Blachowicz in that fight. If he just shot a takedown in round 4, both of Ankalaev's legs have no strength left in them. But yet he let it get to the point where Ankalaev was getting takedowns on him. I don't like that mindset from Jan Blachowicz. And I feel like he might try and strike with Pereira for a bit here. And I think if he does, I think Pereira's going to absolutely walk him down and beat him up. I think he is. I think there's too much power in the hands of Pereira. His striking defense is a bit sus, but I think it's going to be such a high-paced, high-action fight. I think it's going to be about who lands first. And I'm going to go with Alex Pereira being the guy to land first. His takedown defense isn't as bad as people think it is, just because of that one moment in round 3 against Israel Adesanya. Bruno Silva had some pretty good takedown attempts on him. He found his way back up. He sprawled them really well as the fight went on. And I think if he starts sprawling a few and getting confident, we're going to be able to see him start landing some really big shots on Jan Blachowicz. And one thing I've noticed about Jan Blachowicz recently in his game is it was good for him to react to the feints against Israel Adesanya. But he gets a bit twitchy and jittery sometimes when people start feinting leg kicks at him. I can see Alex Pereira tapping him with the leg kicks. Jan Blachowicz might check a few. Then Pereira starts feinting with them and then lunges into that nice tight left hook. And I can see Blachowicz with his hands up, with his knee up, trying to check a kick, getting caught on one leg by a left hook. I'm going to go with Alex Pereira getting a KO here. First of all, I think he's going to absolutely mog Jan Blachowicz. And I think that's going to be a big thing here. He's going to be massive. He is one of the only people in the UFC not lying about their height. He's actually 6'4". And Jan Blachowicz, Usman's 5'10" at best. I saw him stood next to Odell Beckham Jr. He's like 6'1". Jan Blachowicz is about 6'1". He's not that tall. You know what I mean? So I think it's going to be a big physical presence in the cage. Reyes seemed like a physical presence without the skill of Pereira. And Pereira's a lot bigger than Reyes, who also claims 6'4". You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to go with Pereira. He's a huge dude. I think he's too physically present in there. And I think he's going to have Jan Blachowicz backing up. Blachowicz is very good, but one thing that people fail to mention people say, he outstruck Israel Adesanya. He did, but the reason why he outstruck Israel Adesanya is the more important bit. He took basically all finishing power away from his shots just to be able to land on Israel Adesanya. You know what I mean? And people forget about that. He took literally nearly, 60% power off of his shots, just throwing his limbs out there with no power. And that's how he could touch Israel Adesanya's chin. I think if he does start to grit down and throw, he's going to get beat to the punch by Pereira. And I think Pereira's going to put him in a very chaotic fight from the get-go here. And there's also something to the fact that Glover Teixeira is training this man. That's a big factor. You know what I mean? They do work at altitude as well. Teixeira is known to get his work done at altitude at time. You know what I mean? He goes to altitude. He's always had a great cardio. I'm worried that maybe Jan Blachowicz is going to try and trade a little bit early, and Pereira is just going to be too devastating early on. This is a man who at light heavyweight was just finishing top-level kickboxers in the first round with like a head kick, jump knee. You know what I mean? Big, dynamic shots like that. Jan doesn't have that dynamicness. He's very basic, and what he does in basics is very good. But the X factors here, in my opinion, are all in favor of Alex Pereira, and I can definitely see him catching Jan with some big shots, like a stiff jab to the body and backing out, a big right hand to the body and moving out again, a stiff jab to the head like he was timing on Israel Adesanya in round 2, while Adesanya's trying to move around and back up around the cage. I think it's going to be a much better stylistic matchup for Alex Pereira than people think. He has a bit of a reach advantage here, even though Jan Blachowicz does have really long arms. I think Alex Pereira is going to be tagging him with big shots, and I think it's going to be a different level of power than Jan Blachowicz has felt recently in his career, because although Jan Blachowicz is good, a lot of the people that we've seen him KO in his career, they're not known for their one-shot knockout power. You know what I mean? Israel Adesanya, Alexander Rakic, Dominic Reyes, not with the punches at least, although sometimes he does. Not really that. It's not Rumble. You know what I mean? It's not these big power hitters that he's able to finish here. Thiago Santos was a big power hitter, kickboxing Brazilian, was able to finish Jan Blachowicz. You know what I mean? I'm going to have to go with Jan Blachowicz. I'm going to have to go with Alex Pereira here. I think he's going to walk him down, beat him up. Jan Blachowicz got Corey Anderson with a KO. But then I'm looking at the Cachoeira fight. Old man Cachoeira taking him to a split decision. I don't like that. There's certain matchups I don't like him against. And I think Pereira is physically intimidating enough and powerful enough to make Jan Blachowicz a bit more of a hesitant back foot fighter, which is going to take a bit of power off of his shots. And if he's going backwards, he takes power off of his shots. If Pereira's going forwards, he's doubling power into his shots. I'm going to go with Alex Pereira getting this one done by first round KO. And I see him fighting Jiri Prochazka. So let's see how it goes. I've got Alex Pereira winning. And I think his experience, as time goes on, people are going to say stuff. I know he just come off a KO loss as well, but he's moving up in weight. He's not weight cutting anymore. One of the biggest weight cuts in the sport was him down to middleweight. And now he's moving up to light heavyweight. I think that's going to help his chin quite a bit. Jan Blachowicz is 40. He's had a long career in the UFC as well. I think Pereira's got this one in the bag. He's so inexperienced. Any few months is going to give him some tools to pick up and tricks. You know what I mean? So I'm going Alex Pereira by KO. We move on. Up the card, Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje. I'm going with Justin Gaethje over Dustin Poirier. Reason being, I think Justin Gaethje nearly was beating Dustin Poirier in their first fight that they had. Was on his way to beating Dustin Poirier in the first fight that they had. But then he got caught. Of course, Poirier was doing really good. He wasn't on his way. Let me take that all back. He was hanging with Dustin Poirier in that first fight and giving as good as he got. Poirier might have been up on volume, but Gaethje was chewing up his leg, landing his own good shots. Whatever. Poirier ends up winning. Very cool. When I look at the Gaethje who fought Dustin Poirier in that first fight, he had like a self-deletion mindset in that fight. The Gaethje I see against Poirier in their first fight that was competitive was nothing like the Gaethje we are seeing now. Nothing like him. In skill, technique, IQ, fight IQ, general ability. Justin Gaethje is a night and day different fighter than the one that originally fought Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is the same looking guy. Maybe his boxing's got a bit crisper. Maybe his head movement's got a little bit better. To me, he's the same Dustin Poirier, but a little bit more well-refined. You know? And let's not forget this as well. In the Gaethje versus Chandler fight, which was before the Poirier-Chandler fight, which is important when it comes to how much damage Chandler has been taken. In the Gaethje versus Chandler fight, Gaethje was in control of the fight. You know what I mean? Chandler caught him in round 1 and had a big flurry. Other than that, in round 2, he didn't really have much success against Gaethje, and he had a bit of success at the start of round 3 against Gaethje. Gaethje, for the majority of that fight, was in full control. Dustin Poirier against Michael Chandler was in control of that fight for the last 30 seconds of round 1 and the last 30 seconds of the fight. And it went into round 3. He was getting pieced up in round 1 and being very reactionary and kind of shying away from Chandler, eventually finding his opening. But he did get caught and rocked against a cage in that fight. But Chandler's mentally downs, so he didn't finish him. Round 2, he got dominated on the ground. We saw Chandler try and shoot for Gaethje. Now it happened. Whoever's going to get this to the ground, it's Gaethje. Poirier ain't going to be keeping Gaethje down or getting him down. I don't think it's going to be a smart thing to do at altitude, to start wrestling when you're not normally a wrestler. Gaethje is the one who can choose to take this to the ground. And against Fiziev, we saw as the fight went on and they both got sloppy, he is more willing to maybe shoot for that takedown and maybe score out a round in that way. I think that's a huge factor here against Dustin Poirier. And again, the fact that he's just night and day. This isn't going to be a guy with a high and tight guard, walking forward hunched over, being a heavy bag, hoping to land as many leg kicks as he can before he gets KO'd. That was the Gaethje that fought Poirier the first time. The Poirier that fought Gaethje the first time was Dustin Poirier a few years ago. Same guy, pretty much. Gaethje is now move around a lot, don't throw so many leg kicks, throw heavier leg kicks that count, but time them way better. Move around way more, throw counter shots, counter hooks as Poirier's coming forward or as fighters are coming forward. He's a lot better than he once was. With his jab, he's a lot better as well. I think Poirier's going to leave himself exposed, maybe as he's coming forward against Gaethje. And although Poirier's boxing is good, he does leave himself open in those finishing sequences. And that's where we saw Alvarez start to maybe mount a bit of a turn against him as well. Alvarez also beat Gaethje, but again, night and day Gaethje. Gaethje, I think, is going to catch Poirier coming in for like a combination at an end of a round. I think he's going to drop Poirier at some point in this fight. I could see him getting a finish early on here in round 2. I'm going to be real with you. I think I can see him getting a finish early on here in round 2. I think he's a little bit hungrier than Poirier. He's poorer than Poirier. No pun intended. And I think that's just going to make all the difference here. And the last but not least, the main thing that's massively swaying me towards Justin Gaethje here over Poirier is the fact that he trains at Team Elevation. The last card that was at Elevation was the Edwards versus Usman 1 card. Edwards versus Usman 1. I'm going to find the card right now that it was. Let me go back to 2020 here. I will find Edwards versus Usman 2. Sorry. Because the first one happened years before. Edwards versus Usman 2. I believe it was 278, I think. 278. Usman versus Edwards 2. Salt Lake City, Utah. Usman's the only guy on the card who trains at altitude, by the way. Only guy on the card who trains at altitude. Edwards gassed. Costa gassed. Rockhold gassed. Marab only shot like 20 takedowns rather than 50. He gassed. Aldo had low output. He was gassing. Most of the other fighters were. Yanan Wu gassed against Pudilova. Pedro got a quick finish. Romanov completely gassed in that fight. And let Tybura beat him, which is crazy, after beating him up in round 1. Most of the fighters on the card started gassing. Leonardo Santos started slowing down against Jared Gordon. Ange Lusa managed to win against AJ Fletcher, but they both started slowing down in different moments of that fight, and there was momentum shifts there. I've got to go with the main man, Gaethje, because from what we saw from the last Salt Lake City card, Usman was one of the only ones that was able to keep a consistent pace at altitude because he trains at Team Elevation. Poirier doesn't, and I hear all this like, I'm using science to get me ready. You know what I mean? I'm going there 2 weeks before, I'll be ready. Gaethje has been training the last 5 years of his career, at least, at altitude. Longer than that. For his career, Gaethje has been training at altitude. This is his fight to win. I'm going with Justin Gaethje. The altitude is just that one factor too many in favor of Gaethje for me to risk a Poirier pick. And if you look at the odds, he's an underdog. I'm going with Justin Gaethje. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Toodle pip. I'll see you later. Goodbye.